Hello, welcome. Let's see if I can get this video done in shorter, or everything done in this video that I want to get done. So this is the video for chapter 4. The two major issues for, or the three major issues for 4 are slavery, freedom, and the struggle for empire. I want you to pay particular attention to this notion of liberty as opposed to the notion of slavery. Here we see some slaves. Slave culture is a huge part of early America, and that's the first thing we're going to tackle. So, the slave trade was a huge part of the European, African, and American markets. African slavery was taken on to help handle the demand for sugar, tobacco, all the cash crops of both the Caribbean and of the southern colonies. As we talked about, there's this triangular trade. I'm not going to spend too much time on that. I do want to focus on this here, that New York, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island were, although they didn't own a tremendous number of slaves, they profited greatly. In other words, they had a huge number, or they made a huge amount of money buying and selling slaves without necessarily owning the slaves themselves. Let's see. So we went over triangular trade. I'm not going to spend any extra time on this. Though I do want to point out down here that in 1762, John Woolman writes, "The idea of slavery being connected with the black color and liberty of the white, or with the white." Often we assume that racism plays a huge role in the creation of the slave market. But the reality is that racism comes later, or rather isn't seen as the original reason by the people at the time. It takes a while to get to that understanding. So I would like you just to familiarize yourself with the triangular trade. Potentially you could pause here and take a look. Just that, manufactured goods are coming out of Europe. They are picking up slaves in Africa, bringing them to the Americas, where they pick up raw goods, bring them back to Europe, where they are manufactured and sent back out, right? This is a good example of the mercantile system. Here we see a little bit more clearly the actual lines, right? We call it triangular trade, but it's not a perfect triangle. It looks more like an upside down hat, a wizard hat or something. And here we see the populations of the slave trade, right? The majority of slaves were going into the Portuguese Empire. But you can see here that 24% of all slaves captured out of Africa went to the British Caribbean and then were sold again into the British colonies. So while it says 4% here, it's actually a much larger number total in the colonies. Not to mention we also have Indian slavery still. So what's good to know, or what's interesting to know about the African slave trade, is that few Europeans actually went in and captured slaves. More likely, the slaves were captured by other Africans, right? So African tribes would fight each other in war. The losers would be enslaved and then sold at the coast to the whites, most likely to the Portuguese. The Europeans would supply them with guns in order to be able to capture those slaves. So the Europeans essentially just took advantage of the political system in Africa, which was a system of tribes constantly at war with each other, and just used it to their advantage, right? So you can see that racism is not the main reason for slavery. It's just used to support the idea once it started. Here we see the way that slaves are stored. You can see that rather than standing them up or allowing them to sleep comfortably, slaves were literally stored like a cargo, chained together, back to front, and they would spend about a month in this position. That means that although they were fed very little, and any kind of bathroom or human excrement was of course all over the place, which is terrible. It's called the Middle Passage because it's the second leg of the triangular pattern. Men, women, and children were crammed tightly together to maximize profits. They were chained to the decks, to the actual ship, by their neck and their legs. Of course, disease spreads rapidly, so you stuff the boat with more rather than fewer because you're going to lose some to disease. Only 5% headed to the colonies directly. Most were going to South America or the West Indies. And by 1770, 1/5 of the 2.3 million people living in the colonies were Africans or their descendants, which is astounding, right? 20% of the population came through this Middle Passage. Here you can see a ship plan for shipping slaves. You can see that they're all laid down in order to maximize the space. Let's see. Slavery is different in all the colonies, right? It's not exactly the same depending on where you are. The Chesapeake is where American slavery begins, with the slave economy, right? To support the tobacco farmers or the tobacco plantations, you need a huge working population, and the fastest way to get it was slavery. And what happened was, for a long time, the white workers and the slaves had an equal status under the law. They were both poor, so they were both really low. But what happened as more and more slaves came in, the whites were elevated in their status, and blacks were degraded in their status, which meant that they had enjoyed certain political rights, and they were taken away from them, which is what's most unique about Chesapeake slavery. Let's see. Nearly half of all Virginia families owned at least one slave in 1770. It's very, very prominent. And it became a major issue politically, right? Constantly discussing slavery. And the Chesapeake, being the middle of the country, is also sort of the middle ground for slavery. Let's see if I make sure I get anything in here or missed anything. I would like you to go, if I don't talk about a slide, make sure that you read through it. You know, this definitely will help you to find what you need to for the chapter. This is how we know about slavery, right? This is a good example here. Some slaves, when freed, were allowed to write about their lives and about what happened to them. Sometimes just for the sake of a story, they could be translated and sold to the general population. Here we see a picture of slavery in South America, right? This is in Peru. Slavery was prominent throughout the colonies, right? It's not unique to the European or the English colonies, but it was far more strictly regulated and potentially crueler in the American colonies. Again, we see the architect plan. Here we see an overseer, right, watching the women work. Here we see just you know, it's a decoration on a map, but you can see the Virginia planters discussing with each other while the slaves go about their business all day long. Where slavery was much worse was in the Rice Kingdom or the Carolinas and Georgia. By 1730, 2/3 of the population of South Carolina was black. That means that the slaves outnumbered the free people. Partly this is to deal with the indigo crop as well as the rice crop. Let's see. South Carolina planters own more land, which means that they want more slaves to run that land, but rice fields are extraordinarily dangerous by way of disease, so they also lost more slaves, which meant that there was just a tremendous influx of slaves coming in and out of the Carolinas. There is, of course, slavery in the North, but because small farmers dominate the economy and small farmers can't afford a slave, slaves work as specific hands. You know, they do sort of specific jobs, unloading and unloading ships. By the 18th century, 3/4 of the urban elite own at least one slave, whereas in Virginia you saw that that number was much higher. There are no major revolts in the North, which means that the laws treat them a little less harshly. Sorry about that. So the you know, the law didn't have to protect against slave revolts because there are just so few of them. Also, they enjoyed just a greater number of rights. Slave marriages were recognized by law, which means they couldn't be separated, whereas in the South, you could just sell your slaves however you wanted to. There no severe physical punishment for slaves. Slaves could go to court to testify against whites, and they could own property and pass it along to their children, right? Significantly higher quality of life for slaves in the North. Most are going to be in New York Harbor and Boston Harbor, right? That's where the large majority of slaves are working. Here we see an advertisement for slaves, right? To be sold, a cargo of 94 prime and healthy Negroes, right? Men, women, boys. Slaves are sold on the auction, right? They're brought up before a crowd and allowed to be examined, poked, prodded, different qualities for different work. Here we see a picture of a northern family and their slaves serving them. This just demonstrates that slavery is prominent all throughout the colonies and largely accepted. Here we see slaves are depicted in the paintwork or in the artwork so that we can see their wealth, right? Just like one would show off their fancy architecture, their clothing, and their possessions, they're also going to show off their human possessions, i.e. slaves. Here we can see the slave population, right? Notice that Connecticut has the largest slave population in New England, although it's only 3% of our population. New York has a fairly high percent for the Northeast, but the largest numbers are down south. And while you can see that Virginia has the highest number of slaves, it is only 42% of the population. Here we see an ad for a runaway slave. So the newspapers were just filled with ads trying to capture these runaways because they were property. They needed to be returned. We also see this juxtaposed with this idea of slavery is this idea of liberty. The British are beginning what's called the Enlightenment, and they're starting to use this idea of reason, right? Everything needs to be based on reason. And the most reasonable way for a government to exist is by the people, because then the people are allowed to make choices, and therefore they'll suck it up and live with whatever the consequences are. So we see an increased number of voting rights and political participation. We'll keep going here, right? So not only is there voting rights in England, that's a picture of Parliament, but there's also, right, this is done by Paul Revere in Boston, engraving this as liberty, releasing the dove of peace, right? With liberty comes peace. Here we see a poll, right? You see all the people lined up. They want to vote. They're very actively trying to vote. They see it as a necessity to be involved in politics. And most of this comes from the theories of this man, John Locke. And John Locke wrote an essay on the Treatise of Government where he said that basically people can't be ruled unless they give permission, right? No king can rule people without their permission. Here he is. I love the wig. Anybody wants to get me this wig, please feel free. I will wear it. Here we see a picture of, it's an engraving depicting a 1764 Pennsylvania election. The people are very much interested in what the others have to say. Political discourse is extremely important, political participation. And the way that that's shown the most is in the press, right? We see that in the colonies, as opposed to England, where the press is regulated by the king, newspapers in the New World are essentially allowed to print what they want. And when they are persecuted, they start writing under pen names. Ben Franklin being the most famous, he believed he was a huge member of the Enlightenment, probably the most famous man in America at the time. He believed in temperance, right? Not over drinking, not overeating. He wanted to be a calm and level person all the time. And that requires democracy in the ideas of the Enlightenment. And there we see, right, with his famous spectacles and his fur hat, he's the symbol of American ruggedness and elegance at the same time. At this point in time, we see the largest increase in newspaper publication. This is by Mr. Zenger, so I would encourage you to read about the trial of Mr. Zenger. But we see just a huge number of newspapers being printed in the early 1700s because people want to get their ideas out. And every politician has a newspaper, every cause, everybody has a newspaper out there for them. Some people would receive not just one newspaper, but sometimes 6 or 7 newspapers, depending on the different issues they believed in. Another major symbol of the awakening is this idea that religion is not necessarily something that comes from a church. We have this great awakening, and this is this idea that preachers wander around the country and you just choose which preacher you like the best. Some of the more famous were Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield. Their sermons would be printed in the papers, and people would just eat them up, right? You didn't have to go to church, you just had to go listen to the sermon in the town square. And then finally we have this issue of colonial conflict. You can see that the French, the Spanish, and the English have really taken over North America. But the English have grown tremendously. I'm going to run out of time here, so I'm going to skip around. And the conflict really happens in the New York colony along in this area, and this is the French and Indian War, which we will talk about in class next week. So thank you very much.